Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you here to this live stream. My name is Jason Bailey. I'm the Executive Director at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, and we are here today to talk about House Bill 1, the effort to continue reducing Kentucky's income tax and what it would mean for the future of the Commonwealth. Now, as background, the bill has passed the House, and we do expect it to pass the Senate when the legislature reconvenes this week. But this is not the end of the process. The mechanism that the legislature set up last year in what's called House Bill 8, which we'll talk about, and which House Bill 1 this year is a continuation of, has the potential to continue cutting the income tax, Kentucky's largest revenue source, next year and the year after that, and on and on. And the stated goal of some people is to completely eliminate this source. Now, this is quite likely the most dangerous policy path ever considered in the modern history of the Commonwealth. We won't be able to stop it this year, but we do have to be able to stop it in order to have a healthy, safe, educated, and thriving Commonwealth. So the purpose of this event today is to help people become better informed and encourage you to take action at this time that it is being voted on, and then to help build momentum to stop the harms in the future and begin to point our state in a better direction. So I want to start this presentation first by backing up a little bit and talking about the state budget. You know, at its best, the state budget is the most powerful tool we have as a Commonwealth to improve quality of life and to create shared prosperity. More than anything else within our state, it allows us to do together what we can't do alone. The state budget does that through a bunch of ways, primarily including funding preschool through 12th grade education, providing health care to 1.5 million Kentuckians, and additional support for mental health, the Kentuckians with disabilities and substance abuse, protects clean air, water, worker and consumer safety. It subsidizes the cost of college, creates a modern infrastructure we all use and share, and much more. So there are systems that support people and communities behind the cold numbers of a budget. And there's much more we could do together that I'm sure many of you could imagine if we had the resources. What if we created more affordable housing? What if we provided every kid with a child allowance like the wealthy countries already do and many states are now discussing, on and on. So we do have a chance now to do more with this tool because we are at a very interesting moment. I used to say it was a once in a generation opportunity, but now I think it's more accurate to say we have a once in every 50 years opportunity to do more as a state to invest in the things that we all need. Right now, we've seen record revenue growth the past couple of years. We've built up about $2.7 billion in the rainy day fund, which is about 20% of what we spend every year. And that's expected to grow even more this year and next year. And you can see from this graph historically, going back to 1993 when the rainy day fund was created, we've never had more than 4% of our budget set aside. We'll likely have 8 times that amount by this summer. And so I'll talk later about why there are likely temporary reasons it looks like that, but there's no question that we have a chance, if we have the right priorities as a state, to do some really important things together at this moment. And it's a good thing we have extra resources now because we have a lot of catching up to do, starting with the Great Recession in 2008 and fueled by a growing number of tax breaks that the legislature began passing back then that have slowly drained revenue out of our tax code. Kentucky started making budget cuts, 20 rounds of cuts after the Great Recession. Many of them were small at the time, but they really add up. So if you look at our core funding for our K-12 schools, what we call base SEEK in Kentucky, we're putting about 27% fewer dollars now than we were back in 2008 after you take inflation into account. And so that downward trend is large, and it continues in the new budget, even though we have that extra money that I mentioned. Those cuts are creating problems that we once partially solved. For example, in the late 80s, the state Supreme Court ruled our system of school funding unconstitutionally inadequate and inequitable. And in 1990, the legislature passed the Kentucky Education Reform Act, which raised income taxes, corporate taxes, and sales taxes to address the funding problems. And that effort dramatically reduced the funding gap between our rich and our poor school districts, as shown in this graph where the line drops. But state budget cuts over time have led that gap to creep back up, and now it is just about return to those pre-Supreme Court ruling levels. It's created a crisis in terms of a teacher shortage. Average teacher salaries fell by an inflation-adjusted 5% this year, because the state didn't provide districts enough to give adequate raises, and that continued a trend that's resulted in a nearly 15% decline since 2008 in average teacher pay, or that's nearly a $10,000 drop in the purchasing power of the average teacher salary over the last 15 years. That problem is even worse in our rural counties, where again, there's these funding inequities due to the lack of state dollars. Cuts since 2008 as high as 32% in the average teacher salary. We've also cut funding to higher education by 26% since 2008. It's a major contributor to the student loan crisis facing so many. So it used to be the case that 2/3 of the cost of college was paid for by the state and 1/3 by students in terms of the state versus student share. But those ratios have exactly flipped, with the students now picking up 2/3 in the state, 1/3. And that's the reason that 1 in 5 Kentucky adults hold student loan debt, or it's a major reason. The total is $20 billion, and it's a drag on our economy. It keeps many people from being able to start a business, buy a home, save for retirement or other needs. We've also hampered our child care system through state cuts. About half of Kentuckians live in a child care desert now, as many centers have closed. Those that remain are being propped up with federal money from the American Rescue Plan Act. That's doing tremendous work to help eliminate copays, raise wages, make more families eligible, but that money is coming to an end in 2024. And we'll need state money to fill in that gap. We've seen total state services depleted. We've lost about 1/3 of the workforce in state services that we had over 30 years ago. 15,000 jobs have been eliminated, and that's created crises. If you look at the child welfare system, if you look at how people were not able to access unemployment benefits due to an understaffed agency and an antiquated computer system that had not been updated. When you look at the juvenile justice system today, where kids who shouldn't be in these jails at all are being held in cells for much or almost all of the day because these facilities are so severely understaffed. The state just cannot fill positions anymore because pay and benefits have been so depleted, and because of workload problems, including 10 of the last 12 years until this year, with no raise and the end of traditional pensions back in 2014. So this has been happening even though we know we live in a world where we are more vulnerable to crisis. We came into the COVID pandemic with a severely shrunken frontline public health workforce. Even before COVID hit, we had a deadly nation-leading hepatitis A outbreak that can be attributed to a slow response of the state. And we're more vulnerable to floods and tornadoes due to climate change, but have not been putting enough money into rebuilding from the disasters of the last 2 years, much less preparing for the ones to come, as many states are. So the state budget is a crucial and potentially a transformative tool for us to do really good things. We have a once in every 50 years opportunity right now due to some extra money. And the need to do more through our budget is great, in part because we've been weakening that tool in the recent past, as I've described. At the same time, as this budget story and these important budget choices are now facing us, we also face some dramatic and very consequential changes the General Assembly is now making to our tax system, the way that we pay for our budget. It's important that we understand what's happening, what the impact is on all of us, and what it will mean moving forward. Well, one principle you hear about the General Assembly's approach to tax policy is they want to move us to a consumption-based tax system. That means more reliance on sales taxes, less reliance on income taxes. And when you do that, that is a tax shift. As this graph shows, lower and middle income people pay far more of their income in sales taxes, which are the blue bar, because they spend all of their income out of necessity to make ends meet. The wealthy are able to save more of their income, so don't face sales taxes as much. And in contrast, income taxes tend to ask more of those who have more, especially graduated income taxes like Kentucky used to have. So this shows our tax system as of 2018. And even with a flat income tax then, lower income people pay less in income taxes because of deductions and credits, but far more than those people at the top do in sales taxes. So in 2018, the General Assembly started to make this shift. They passed a bill that changed our graduated income tax, which went from 2% to 6%, to a flat tax of 5%. And along with some other changes, they applied the sales tax to some new services, including pet grooming and veterinarians, auto repair, bowling, dry cleaning. And the result was that the bottom 95% of Kentuckians paid more in average on taxes, while only the top 5% paid less, and especially the top 1% who got over a $6,000 annual tax cut. So that was the first step. This was a tax shift. It wasn't designed to cut taxes overall, but it did shift who pays. But now, as mentioned earlier, the revenue picture has really changed a lot. After years of revenue growth averaging around 3% a year, we suddenly saw growth of 11% in 2021, 15% in 2022. But that wasn't because of the tax plan that passed in 2018 or anything else that Kentucky did. It was because the federal government did its job in preventing an economic depression during COVID-19 by providing an enormous amount of pandemic aid. About $45 billion came to Kentucky in the form of stimulus checks and expanded child tax credit, food aid, and more. And it created the strongest growth from a recovery that we've had in modern times. As a result, 49 states had budget surpluses last year. And as a whole, all states had double-digit revenue growth the last couple of years, just like Kentucky did. We've also had high inflation fueled by supply chain bottlenecks and the war in Ukraine. That's also made tax revenues go up. But that's not extra money, because inflation is also driving up state costs to buy supplies and equipment, to build buildings, and to hire and retain employees. And both the pandemic aid and inflation are coming to an end. You can see it in the forecast that revenue drops off this year and will actually turn negative for the first time since the Great Recession in 2024 if they pass House Bill 1's income tax reduction. So I think on the surface, the choice seems obvious. We have extra money for once and have longstanding needs that should be addressed. So we should begin to put the money toward the needs. But instead, what we're seeing is an effort to pass very deep tax cuts and use the extra temporary revenues to hide their impact in the short term. Maybe the most important thing to understand about this idea of reducing and even eliminating the income tax is that the income tax funds 41% of the state budget. So it's the cornerstone of the way that we pay for the things we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And the plan to reduce and even eliminate the income tax is being put forward with no plan and no viable options to replace the revenue that we would lose. So this started with House Bill 8 that passed in the 2022 General Assembly, and that proposed to take up to 0.5 point off our 5% income tax each year. And it has a formula that's based on a 1-year snapshot of revenue. How much is in the rainy day fund? And how much are we collecting in revenues above what we are spending? It makes permanent tax cuts based on a one-time look at the revenue picture, which, as I said earlier, has been unusually good for a few temporary reasons. The first cut from a 5% income tax to 4.5% is automatic, and it happened January 1. The formula they created under House Bill 8 says, because we had another good year last year, we can go ahead and make the next cut from 4.5% to 4%. And that is what they're considering under House Bill 1 in the current General Assembly. These cuts are making a big decision, kind of like a tattoo, and given the flawed nature of the formula, making permanent decisions based on temporary conditions, a little like this tattoo, in which both the artist and the recipient of the tattoo did not look carefully at what they are doing. Tattoos are painful and expensive to remove, and so will the tax cut be painful and very expensive to roll back in the future. At the same time, the legislature is lowering the income tax. They also applied the sales tax to about 35 different services, family portraits and other photography, taxis and Ubers, parking, AAA membership, moving costs, wedding space, etc. are now taxed. But those taxes aren't nearly big enough to offset the revenue that's lost from reducing the income tax. For every dollar in new revenue these taxes will generate, we're already losing $6 from the income tax cut down to 4.5%. And if House Bill 1 passes, we'll lose $12 in revenue for every dollar these new taxes will bring in. So although there's talk about moving to a consumption-based tax system and away from income taxes, in the case of this legislation, it's not even doing that to any significant degree. It is creating a very large hole in the revenue stream that's hidden for the moment because of the temporary surplus, but the bill will come due over time. So how big is that hole, that revenue hole? Well, $1.2 billion from going from a 5% income tax to a 4% is more than we spend on all of higher education. So we've got 8 universities, 16 community colleges across Kentucky. That 1 point income tax cut is more expensive than what we spend on those institutions. It's about half of what we spend on the entire Medicaid program, which covers 1.5 million Kentuckians, just to make that 1 point cut. So even small cuts in the income tax rate are very, very expensive, and the legislature has proposed no way that we're going to pay for that down the road. So who benefits when you cut the income tax? Overwhelmingly, it's the people at the very top in terms of wealth, because of incredible and growing income inequality that exists in our state and in our society. If you're in the wealthiest 1% of Kentuckians who make about $1.4 million a year, you are getting an $11,000 tax cut on average annually from reducing the tax rate down to 4%. That's what this graph shows. For the typical working class Kentuckian, for somebody making $15 an hour or less, is about 30% of workers do in our state. It's about enough to cover a cell phone bill for a month, a year, 1 month a year. Not enough to change your life, and that's before all the eventual sales tax increases and service reductions that will have to result down the road. It's no help to about 1 million people in Kentucky, 30% of whom are kids, who, even though they do pay sales taxes and lots of other taxes, they don't pay income taxes because their incomes are so low. And we have a low income credit we created back in 2005. Also, 85% of seniors or retirees, all but the highest income seniors, won't get anything because we exempt much of retirement income from the income tax. So people with low wages and on fixed incomes, those who are most hurt by inflation in this moment, will not benefit from reducing the income tax at all. 2/3 of the dollars from an income tax reduction flow to the highest earning 20% of people. This is just a different way of showing what's in the last graph. The wealthiest 1% of people will get 20% of the dollars. The wealthiest 20% of people will only get 1% of the dollars. The former don't need the help, the latter do, but this has those priorities exactly backwards. Cutting the income tax also widens racial inequities. 92% of Kentuckians in the top 20% are white, compared to 86% of all Kentuckians, and Black and Latino Kentuckians are underrepresented among the wealthiest people. It's also a hit to our rural areas. If you look at geography, the county that will benefit the most from income tax cuts is Oldham County. Median income about $100,000 a year. 1 in 6 people make more than $200,000 a year in Oldham County. But if you contrast that with Wolfe County, the median income is only $24,000 a year. So it provides very little to our poorest rural areas, while providing much bigger tax cuts to wealthy suburbs. Another way to look at that same phenomenon is to look at schools. Public education is the largest item in the state budget. It's funded through a combination of state and local and a little bit of federal money. But because local wealth varies so widely across Kentucky, the state by formula does more for those with less wealth. So in the Anchorage Independent School District, in a wealthy part of suburban Louisville, only 31% of the dollars come from the state. In Wolfe County, in Eastern Kentucky, in contrast, 88% of those dollars come from state money. As we've shown before, the gap is widening between those wealthy and poor school districts. And if we lower or even eliminate our biggest state revenue source, of course, that problem is going to get worse. The only answer that proponents seem to provide, the kind of evidence I've been laying out in this presentation, is that cutting income taxes will allegedly grow our economy. Well, we have a lot of experience with that around the country. There have been income tax experiments in a number of states over the last decade. Most famously in Kansas, the governor there said it would be a shot of adrenaline in the heart of the Kansas economy. Businesses and people would flock there as a result of reducing their income tax, but instead they saw large budget deficits. They had 3 credit downgrades. They had to end the school year early one year because of insufficient funds. And they had their Supreme Court rule that their school funding was unconstitutional. And so the Kansas legislature had to come back 5 years later and roll it all back. And their governor had to resign his post. Kansas is the worst case, the worst example, but there are other states like Wisconsin and Ohio, Arizona and Michigan who cut their income taxes, and what they saw was lower revenues, not economic growth. We know that the most prosperous states in the country with the lowest poverty rates and the best health tend to have income taxes as the cornerstone of their tax system. It's the best and most equitable option states have to ensure good schools, improved health, a better quality of life, and modern infrastructure. In fact, those states with the highest top income tax rates are performing better in recent years economically than states with no income tax at all. Tennessee is not a model. It is also a poor state like Kentucky. People die on average 5 to 6 years earlier than the wealthy states in Tennessee, just like in Kentucky. Almost all of those wealthy states have income taxes. Tennessee has among the most inequitable tax systems in the country, including much higher sales taxes that they apply to groceries. And their lack of an income tax means they're spending far less than we are on education, on healthcare, where they have an expanded Medicaid, and so aren't seeing the health gains as a result. And they have an economic structure that allows them to rely more on sales taxes because they have the tourism. The Great Smoky Mountains has 14 million visitors a year. It's the most popular, most visited national park in the country. We do not have the tourism equivalent of Tennessee. Only 9 states don't have an income tax. And most all of them have one of 2 things: either a lot of tourism, like Florida, Tennessee, Nevada, where Las Vegas is, or they have natural resources, like oil and gas resources, like Texas, Alaska, and Wyoming, that they are able to tax. Kentucky does not have that anymore at any significant level, so cannot rely on it to the extent those states do. So we can't expect this promised economic bonanza from reducing our income tax. As noted earlier, we have a lot of money now for temporary reasons. It's not a lot when you begin to reduce the income tax. And once you recognize that trickle-down economic theory is not going to pan out. We have enough in our rainy day fund to last about 3 years if we had to rely on it to close the budget gap from House Bill 1. And there are growing concerns we could hit a recession in the next year or 2 because of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. And if that were to happen, funds, both costs would go up because more people would qualify for things like Medicaid, and revenues would falter. There's no plan or path that has been proposed to replace the revenues we're going to lose by reducing or even eliminating the income tax. And it's very, very expensive. The sales tax is the only tax that comes anywhere close to raising the revenue that an income tax cut raises, but we already have a 6% sales tax. To replace the cost of going to a 4% income tax with a higher sales tax, we'd have to raise the sales tax to 7.4%. That's the highest state sales tax rate in the entire country. If they wanted to tax groceries like Tennessee, which at the full rate, which we shouldn't do, that would generate only half of what we lose from just a 1-point reduction in the income tax. The state has taken most all of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to applying the sales tax to services, so there's not a lot of options there. And so the idea that they're going to raise the sales tax eventually, I think is far-fetched, especially when they're not even doing it now when they're cutting taxes. But even if they eventually do, the options are very few and they're very regressive. So there are better alternatives that Kentuckians can easily articulate about how to use our surpluses and how to use these resources. At our annual KyPolicy conference last week, we asked the participants, how would you spend $1.2 billion annually to meet Kentucky's needs? And of the roughly 150 folks there, it was unanimous that all our state's needs have not been met. We did an exercise where we asked folks to post their ideas, and we get a lot of great ideas. But in terms of the most frequently stated ones, 34 people mentioned housing, including relating to flood recovery in Eastern Kentucky. 28 mentioned childcare. 25 identified higher education. 22 pointed to teacher pay, and 20 to mental health services. So there are abundant needs and that are not being filled now that folks can point to that would be better uses of these resources. So assuming House Bill 1 passes, as we expect it to do this week, we need to begin talking about a way to climb out of the hole that's been created. And I do want to point to one bill that's already been introduced that provides a vital first step to rebuilding from that harm. It's certainly not going to pass right now, but it is something to talk about that provides a way forward. House Bill 111, which was been filed by Representative Lisa Wilner, would bring back a graduated income tax like most states have and like we had for over 80 years. All income over $100,000 would be taxed at 5%, over $125,000 at 6%. And it would raise about, so it would bring back the top rate of 6% we had for since the 1930s. It would raise over $640 million a year, not all we would need to fill this hole, but a good start and a way to prevent harmful cuts while we have these solid surpluses. And it would say we should start rebuilding by asking our tax code by going where the money is. And that's with the people at the top. The bottom 80% would pay no more in taxes. The next 15% would pay $42 more a year. And the top 5%, really the top 1%, who would be paying more. So this provides a place for us to start the conversation and as an alternative to budget cuts or regressive sales tax increases down the road. So I'll sum up here by just saying that the budget is a critical tool to build a better Kentucky. We have a once in 50 years opportunity now because of the temporary surpluses to begin getting our budget back on the right track. But instead, we are seeing this effort to pass huge tax cuts that are skewed to the wealthy and that will weaken that tool for all future years while using those temporary conditions to mask the eventual impact. There are needs out there that are better uses of these resources, and there are tax policies we can support that will head us in a better direction. So last thing I'll say is that it's important that we talk about this issue, that we let lawmakers know, that we talk with organizations we're involved in our community about this issue and why it's so important. So there's some steps that you all can take, some actions you can take. The first is obviously to call your legislators, particularly your senators, and let them know that you would like them to fund our future rather than tax giveaways to the wealthy and to vote no on House Bill 1. And the number to call, the toll-free line for lawmakers, is on the screen. You can also send them an email. We have an Action Network page that allows you to send an email. We will post that in the chat for this live stream. So you can click on that and send an email to your lawmakers, your senators. Also, help people understand this issue better. Write a letter to the editor, post on social media that explains your concerns, explains what the impact will be, particularly if we continue to go down this path of eventually eliminating our largest revenue source. And to help you do that, and just to learn more, You can visit our website, which is www.kypolicy.org, to learn more and to get that information and spread the word. So I want to thank you so much for joining us for this live stream. Appreciate all you do. Be in touch with us if you have any questions, and thanks so much.